Shadow Town. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Jack Reacher had no plans, as usual. He had taken the bus out of a larger city that morning, letting the journey take him wherever it pleased. This time, the wheels stopped in a small, dusty town named Twin Pines. The air was dry, and the streets were deserted, save for a few parked cars that hadn't moved in what looked like weeks. Reacher stepped off the bus, his tall frame casting a long shadow on the cracked pavement. He wore his typical attire, jeans, a faded t-shirt, and boots built to last. His only luggage was the heavy jacket slung over his shoulder. As the bus pulled away, its roar fading into the distance, the quiet of Twin Pines enveloped him. He scanned the town. Two streets met at a worn-out crossroads, with a few old buildings scattered around. A diner with a flickering neon sign. A gas station with no cars in sight. A hardware store, its windows clouded with dust. Not much else. He walked toward the diner. Hunger wasn't the reason, he rarely needed to eat right away. But the diner was the only place that showed signs of life. As he approached, the bell above the door jingled softly. The room inside was dimly lit, with a handful of booths lined along the wall. A single waitress, mid-30s, blonde hair tied back, glanced at him from behind the counter. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat but curious. Reacher nodded and slid into a booth near the back. From there, he could see the whole place, habit from his military days. The waitress brought him the coffee, and he took a slow sip, tasting the bitterness. No one else was in the diner, but there was a tension in the air, something Reacher had learned to recognize. This town wasn't just sleepy, it was hiding something. Before long, the front door swung open. Two men walked in, both wearing flannel shirts and jeans, looking like they'd stepped out of a western. Their eyes scanned the room before landing on Reacher. They exchanged a glance before heading straight for him. Reacher kept still, watching their approach. They stopped at his booth, standing over him. The bigger one, with a scruffy beard and a thick neck, spoke first. "You're not from around here," he said, his tone less a question, more a statement. Reacher didn't respond, just looked up at them with his usual calm. "Folks don't like strangers in Twin Pines," the bearded man added, leaning in slightly. Reacher took another sip of his coffee, eyes locked on the man, then placed the cup down. "That's so," he replied, voice low and even. The second man, slimmer but just as menacing, stepped closer. "You'd be smart to catch the next bus out. This ain't a place for drifters." Reacher gave a half-smile, leaning back in the booth. "Guess I'll stick around and find out." The two men stared at him for a long moment, clearly unsettled by his lack of fear. Without another word, they turned and walked out, but not before the bearded one shot him a last, threatening glance. As the door closed behind them, the waitress approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "You don't want trouble with them," she muttered, pouring more into his cup. Reacher met her gaze, unfazed. "Who are they?" She glanced at the door, then back at him. "They're with the Braddock brothers. They run this town." Reacher nodded slightly. "What do they run?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "Everything. And anyone who tries to stand up to them." Her voice trailed off, but the message was clear. Reacher took another sip of his coffee, feeling the familiar stir of justice rising in his chest. Twin Pines had a problem. And Jack Reacher wasn't one to walk away from problems. Want to see what happens when Jack Reacher digs deeper into this town's dark secrets? Stay tuned and share to keep the suspense going. Chapter 2. The Threat. The next morning, Jack Reacher woke early. The small motel on the edge of town was as rundown as the diner. He hadn't paid much attention when he checked in, but now, as he lay on the stiff mattress, he replayed the conversation with the waitress in his mind. The Braddock brothers. They were the power behind the town's quiet fear. Reacher had seen this before, in countless places across the country. Small towns taken over by local tyrants who ruled with intimidation, money, or worse. But something about Twin Pines felt different. It wasn't just the way the two thugs had tried to scare him off. It was the silence. The kind that suggested people had given up on fighting back. He dressed quickly, pulling on his boots and jacket, and left the motel. The air was still cool, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. As he walked through the empty streets, his mind turned to the Braddocks. He would find out who they were, and why this town was so tightly under their grip. At the diner, the same waitress from the night before was already working, serving coffee to a couple of tired-looking regulars. She noticed Reacher as soon as he walked in, her eyes briefly widening in surprise. "You're still here," she said, half surprised, half concerned. "Guess I didn't take their advice," Reacher replied, sliding into the same booth as the night before. The waitress approached cautiously, lowering her voice. "You should have left." Reacher gave her a steady look. "Why?" She looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Because the Braddocks don't let anyone stick around who doesn't belong. They control everything. The sheriff, the businesses, even the bus schedules. If they want you gone, you'll be gone." "Why haven't you left?" Reacher asked. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor. "Some of us can't," she whispered. "Not without paying a price." Reacher leaned back in his seat, his mind working. She was trapped, like the rest of the town. But what had caught his attention now was the mention of the sheriff. If the Braddocks had the law in their pocket, this wasn't just a case of local thugs. It was something bigger, something that demanded attention. Before Reacher could press her for more details, the door to the diner opened. This time, it wasn't the two men from the night before. It was a single figure, a woman, tall, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, with dark hair tied back in a ponytail. Her eyes swept the room, then locked onto Reacher. She walked straight toward him, no hesitation, and stopped at his table. "You're the one who's been asking about the Braddocks," she said, her voice low but steady. Reacher looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "Who's asking?" She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Someone who doesn't want to see another stranger disappear in this town." Reacher said nothing, just studied her. There was something in her eyes, fear, yes, but also defiance. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't going to back down. "Who are you?" Reacher asked. "Emily Braddock," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "And you need to leave town. Now." Reacher just met someone from the inside. What is Emily hiding? Share and stay tuned for the next twist. Chapter 3. The Warning. Reacher stared at Emily Braddock, taking in her words but not reacting immediately. The name confirmed what he'd suspected. She was connected to the people who ran this town. But her warning, her urgency, hinted at something deeper. Something personal. "Why should I leave?" Reacher asked, his voice calm. Emily glanced around the diner nervously, then leaned in closer. "Because my brothers won't stop until you're gone. They control everything here, and they don't take kindly to anyone poking around where they shouldn't." Reacher didn't flinch. "Seems like your brothers have a lot of enemies." Emily's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists. "They're not the kind of people you want to cross. Trust me. I'm trying to help you." "Why?" Reacher asked, eyes narrowing. "Why help me?" For a moment, Emily's tough exterior cracked. She looked away, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I'm trapped too." Reacher watched her carefully. There it was again, the same look he'd seen in the waitress and in the eyes of the few townspeople he'd passed. Emily wasn't just warning him. She was desperate, and it wasn't just for him. She was trying to save herself. Before he could press her for more, the door to the diner opened once again. This time, 3 men walked in, all wearing the same rough flannel and jeans as the others. They were bigger, meaner looking, and clearly on a mission. The leader, with a thick scar running down his cheek, locked eyes with Emily and marched over to the table. "What are you doing here?" the Mun demanded, his voice booming through the quiet diner. Emily straightened, her face hardening. "Just talking to a customer." The Mun shot a glance at Reacher, sizing him up in an instant. "This the guy?" Emily didn't respond, but the tension between her and the Mun was palpable. Reacher stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the scarred man's face. "I'm Jack Reacher," he said, voice steady. "Who are you?" The Mun sneered. "You don't need to know my name. All you need to know is you're leaving. Now." Reacher looked down at the man's boots, then back up at his scarred face. "I don't take orders from guys who don't introduce themselves." The man's hand twitched toward his belt, where a knife handle was visible. Reacher saw it coming before the man even moved. He stepped forward, swift and precise, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. The knife clattered to the floor, and the Mun let out a grunt of pain. The two others moved to intervene, but Reacher's eyes flashed with a warning. "Don't," he said, his voice cold. They hesitated, knowing the outcome would be the same. Reacher released the scarred man, who stumbled back, clutching his arm in pain. "You don't know what you're getting into," he growled, spitting on the ground. "You think you're tough? You're dead." Reacher stepped closer, his gaze like steel. "Maybe. But not today." The scarred man backed away, his eyes narrowing with a promise of future violence. He motioned to his men, and the three of them left the diner without another word. Emily looked at Reacher, wide-eyed. "You don't know what you've done." Reacher shrugged. "Doesn't matter. They won't be the last ones to try." Emily stood abruptly, her voice shaking. "You don't understand. They'll come for you tonight. My brothers, they won't stop. And when they come, they'll bring the whole town with them." Reacher glanced at the door, then back at Emily. "Then I'll be ready." Things are heating up. Will Reacher be ready for the Braddocks? Stay tuned and share to keep the suspense alive. Chapter 4. The Setup. Night fell over Twin Pines like a blanket, thick and oppressive. The town seemed to hold its breath, the streets eerily empty, as if everyone knew what was coming. Reacher had spent the afternoon preparing. He wasn't worried, he'd been through worse. But he knew better than to underestimate an opponent, especially one with deep roots in a place like this. He had moved to a room at the back of the motel, away from the street. Fewer windows, more cover. As he sat in the darkened corner, waiting, his mind ran over the events of the day. Emily Braddock's warning still echoed in his ears. She had tried to convince him to leave, but he wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. He'd seen the fear in her eyes, the way her voice trembled when she spoke about her brothers. They were coming for him, and she knew it. But Reacher wasn't concerned about a few thugs with knives. What concerned him was the deeper grip the Braddocks had on this town. The sheriff, the businesses, the fear. It was always the fear. A soft knock on the motel door pulled him out of his thoughts. Reacher stood silently, moving toward the door with calculated steps. He didn't bother asking who it was. Anyone knocking this late in Twin Pines wasn't here for friendly conversation. He opened the door a crack, just enough to see a familiar face. Emily Braddock stood on the other side, her expression tense. She glanced over her shoulder, checking the empty parking lot before slipping inside. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Reacher nodded. "How many?" "More than you think," she replied. "My brothers, they don't do things halfway. They've got half the town under their thumb, and when they call in favors, people listen." Reacher looked her over, noticing the tightness in her stance. She was afraid, but not just for him. She was afraid of what would happen if he stayed. "Why are you here?" Emily swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I don't want anyone else getting hurt. Not because of them. "Why help me?" Reacher asked, his voice calm but probing. For a moment, Emily said nothing. Then she lifted her eyes to meet his. "Because they're my brothers, but that doesn't mean I agree with what they've done. This town, it used to be different. They used to be different." Reacher could see the weight of her words hanging in the air. She wasn't just trying to save him. She was trying to save herself from the guilt of whatever was coming. Before either of them could say another word, the low rumble of engines broke the stillness outside. Headlights pierced through the night, casting long shadows across the motel parking lot. Reacher moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A convoy of trucks had pulled up, their engines idling menacingly. At least a dozen men climbed out, armed with pipes, bats, and a few hunting rifles slung over shoulders. Leading them was the scarred man from earlier, still nursing the arm Reacher had twisted behind his back. Beside him, two other figures emerged, one tall and broad, the other wiry but with a look of quiet menace. "Your brothers," Reacher muttered. Emily nodded, her face pale. "Mark and Cole. And they brought everyone with them." Reacher stepped back from the window, assessing the situation. "They'll come in hard and fast. They think they can overwhelm me with numbers. They don't know better." Emily's voice trembled. "You don't have to do this. You can still leave." Reacher gave her a hard look. "That's not how I'm built." Outside, the men began to spread out, surrounding the building. Reacher's military instincts kicked in. He had the advantage of cover and elevation. If they wanted him, they'd have to come in close, and that was where he thrived. He turned back to Emily. "Get down. Stay out of sight." She hesitated, but the look in Reacher's eyes left no room for argument. She ducked behind the bed, her breathing quick and shallow. Reacher moved toward the door, his posture relaxed but ready for whatever came next. The first shout rang out from the lot. "Reacher! Come out, or we'll burn this place to the ground." Reacher cracked his knuckles, his mind sharpening, focusing. He was ready. The tension is about to explode. Will Reacher take down the Braddocks? Share and follow to find out. Chapter 5. The Standoff. The motel room was silent, save for the muffled sounds of the men gathering outside. Jack Reacher stood still, his mind running through every scenario, calculating every possible move. The Braddock brothers were trying to intimidate him, but they had no idea who they were up against. He'd been in far worse situations and come out on top. "Reacher," a voice bellowed again from outside. "Last chance. Come out, or we're coming in." Reacher glanced out the window one more time. Mark and Cole Braddock stood at the center of the group, their faces twisted with rage and determination. The scarred man, their enforcer, was pacing nearby, eager for violence. Around them, a dozen or more armed men waited for orders, some gripping rifles, others holding makeshift weapons. He turned back to Emily, who was crouched behind the bed, eyes wide with fear. "Stay down," he said quietly. "This is going to get loud." Emily nodded, her breath shaky. Reacher could tell she was on edge, but he needed her to keep calm. If anything went wrong, she'd need to stay out of the crossfire. Reacher moved back to the door, cracking his neck and rolling his shoulders, loosening his muscles. He could hear footsteps approaching the building, heavy boots crunching on the gravel. They were coming. The first sound was the door being kicked, hard. The wooden frame groaned but held. Another kick followed, stronger this time, causing the hinges to shudder. Reacher waited, patient, like a predator in the dark. On the third kick, the door burst open. Two men charged in, one holding a bat, the other gripping a hunting knife. Before either of them could react, Reacher stepped forward. His fist shot out, fast and brutal, catching the man with the bat square in the jaw. The impact sent him crashing to the ground, unconscious before he hit the floor. The second man swung the knife wildly, trying to catch Reacher off guard, but Reacher was faster. He ducked under the blade, then grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the knife dropped. With a quick, powerful shove, he sent the men sprawling into the wall. More footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. More were coming. Reacher picked up the fallen knife and stepped into the doorway, blocking their advance. 3 more men barreled down the hall, but they hesitated when they saw the 2 bodies already on the floor. Reacher's cold stare stopped them in their tracks. "You want to try again?" Reacher asked, his voice low and dangerous. For a moment, they seemed to reconsider. But then the scarred man appeared behind them, barking orders. "Take him down." The men rushed forward, but Reacher was ready. He sidestepped the first attacker, using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. The second swung a crowbar, but Reacher blocked it with his forearm, then countered with a sharp elbow to the man's ribs, knocking the air out of him. The scarred man charged in next, swinging a pipe with deadly force. Reacher ducked, the pipe whistling past his head, then came up with a brutal uppercut that caught the man under the chin. He staggered back, dazed, but not out. Reacher pressed the advantage, moving in quickly. A solid right hook to the man's jaw sent him sprawling onto the floor, the pipe clattering from his hand. Reacher stood over him, eyes locked on his. "Tell your bosses this is over." The scarred man groaned, but Reacher didn't wait for a response. He turned, knowing more were on the way. Back in the room, Emily watched in stunned silence, her eyes wide as she saw what Reacher was capable of. The men who had come to take him down were lying unconscious or groaning in pain. But Reacher knew this was far from over. The Braddock brothers were still outside, and they wouldn't stop until this was finished. He walked back to the window, peeking through the blinds. Mark and Cole Braddock stood by their trucks, watching as their men failed to take Reacher down. Their expressions had shifted from confident to furious. Reacher stepped outside, into the night air. The remaining men backed away as he approached, uncertain and afraid. The Braddocks, however, didn't flinch. "Looks like you're running out of friends," Reacher said calmly, his eyes locked on Mark. Cole, the wiry one, sneered. "You think you can just walk into our town and do this? You're dead, Reacher." Reacher raised an eyebrow. "I don't think so." Mark Braddock, the older brother, stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You don't know what you've just started. This town belongs to us." Reacher's voice was cold, steady. "Not anymore." Mark's hand twitched toward his belt, where a gun was holstered. But before he could make a move, Reacher was on him. In a blur of motion, he disarmed Mark with a swift strike, then sent him crashing to the ground with a single punch. Cole lunged forward, but Reacher grabbed him by the collar, slamming him into the side of the truck. The rest of the men stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The Braddocks had fallen, and with them, their control over the town. Jack Reacher just turned the tables. What happens next? Share and follow to see how the story unfolds. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The aftermath of the fight left the Braddock brothers sprawled in the dust, groaning in pain, their authority shattered. The men who had once followed their every command now stood in uneasy silence, unsure of what to do next. Jack Reacher stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, daring anyone else to step forward. No one did. Reacher wiped the sweat from his brow, then glanced down at the Braddocks. Mark Braddock, the elder of the two, was struggling to sit up, clutching his ribs where Reacher's punch had landed. His younger brother, Cole, was still gasping for breath against the side of the truck, his face twisted in both pain and disbelief. Reacher knelt down in front of Mark, his voice cold and calm. "It's over. You're not running this town anymore." Mark spat blood onto the ground, his eyes filled with hate. "You don't get it, do you?" he rasped. "You think beating us changes anything? We own this place. People don't just forget that overnight." Reacher's eyes narrowed. "They will, once they know you're finished." Mark's sneer faltered. He knew, deep down, that Reacher was right. His grip on Twin Pines had been built on fear, and fear had a way of evaporating when people saw weakness. And right now, lying broken in the dirt, he was nothing but weak. Reacher stood up, looking over at the remaining men. "You've got two choices," he said, his voice carrying across the lot. "You can either help them up and walk away, or you can stay here and explain to the sheriff why two men from this town just got beat to a pulp. Your call." The men exchanged uneasy glances. The Braddocks' reign of terror had held them in check for years, but now, with their leaders broken, the fear was gone. Slowly, one by one, they began to back away, leaving the Braddocks behind. Emily emerged from the motel, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The men who had terrorized the town were on the ground, defeated, their power slipping away like sand through their fingers. For the first time in years, there was hope. Reacher walked over to her, his expression unreadable. "You're free now," he said simply. Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with both relief and uncertainty. "What happens next?" "That's up to you," Reacher replied. "But you're going to have to step up. The town's been under their control for a long time. People are going to need someone to lead them now." Emily swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling on her. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Reacher said firmly. "You already have. You warned me. You stood up when no one else would." She nodded slowly, taking in his words. For years, she had felt powerless, caught between loyalty to her family and the horror of what they had done to the town. But now, with her brothers defeated, she realized she had a choice. And it was time to take it. Reacher looked back at the Braddocks one last time. They were still on the ground, broken and defeated. They would never hold Twin Pines the way they once had. "I'll call the sheriff," Emily said quietly. "He'll take care of the rest." Reacher gave a slight nod, then turned toward the road. His work here was done. He didn't need to stay and watch what happened next. He knew that the town would be all right, as long as people like Emily stood up and kept fighting. He started walking, his long stride carrying him away from Twin Pines, just as the sun began to rise over the horizon. The road stretched out in front of him, endless and open. There would be another town, another problem, somewhere down the line. That was just the way things were for Jack Reacher. But for now, Twin Pines was free. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.